All right, guys, turn to Proverbs 15 in your Bibles. Like David said, we're talking about gentleness today. Let's see if I have this in here. No? I need a second to find it too. Oh, here.
Page 302.
302. Oh, wait. Okay. Proverbs 15. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The tongue of the wise adorns knowledge, but the mouth of the fool gushes folly. The eyes of the Lord are everywhere, keeping watch on the wicked and the good. The soothing tongue is a tree of life, but a perverse tongue crushes the spirit. Gentleness is not a strong value that we have in our culture. We enjoy when others are gentle with us, but we rarely give others the same treatment that we expect from them. It's in our instincts to retaliate, to be vengeful. This isn't lifting. No, one second. Whatever. It's fine. It's in our instincts. Our instincts to look after ourselves first, but what Jesus showed us and taught us is that if we can go against our selfish instincts, then we can have a massive impact on the world. I know I say this every week that I preach, and especially when I've been preaching on all these different values. But if we can allow Jesus to, But I really believe that there are little revivals and outbreaks of the Spirit waiting behind the doors of each of the virtues we've been teaching. So if we can allow Jesus to help us unlock those doors, we can actually see God moving in and around the people that we see every day. And I believe that gentleness is one of the foremost values that we need to allow God to cultivate in our hearts. It's one of the greatest virtues that God can put inside of us. Rick Warren said in a sermon about 10 years ago about gentleness, he said, "You're not a doormat for being gentle. You're just not overreacting. You're in control of your own emotions." I've been told a lot in my past and present that I'm a peaceful person. I grew up in a house full of really loud people with a lot of hot tempers. So I learned from a very young age that gentleness is always the best way to be when you interact with others, and especially when you're in conflict with somebody. Even before a conflict arises, treating somebody with gentleness shows them that you care about them more than your own opinions, more than your future conflicts, and more than yourself. So then when something does come up, people will know how you are going to treat them. So they will approach you without walls. I've also had to learn how to read both verbal and nonverbal cues in conversations in my life. And I can pretty easily tell if somebody is not being genuine with me. It used to kind of drive me crazy, and I would get mad at people for not trusting me enough to be transparent with me. But as I've grown and learned how to deal with more fake people, I've learned that gentleness is also the best way to get somebody to be genuine with you, because it communicates that you're being genuine with them, and it invites them to open up to us as well. Gentleness has helped me get into situations where people just share stuff with me. It's part of like that being a person of peace, I think. Where people just feel comfortable and like they can just let their guard down around me. So when I just start asking questions about people, they're a lot more willing to share the deeper, darker, more or like more intimate like details about their lives. So, yeah, let me see here. Gentleness has also helped me diffuse conflicts very quickly. It's helped me get to the root cause of issues instead of, building and building and building until somebody says something that they're going to regret. It's also helped me find amazing opportunities for ministry and service to people, and it is the gift that keeps on giving. So where is gentleness in the Bible, and what is the biblical sort of definition of gentleness? This is going to be the meat of what we're talking about today, because gentleness is all over the Bible. So first, there's a few points I'm going to make, but the first one is gentleness diffuses conflict. Okay? So going back to Proverbs 15:1, it says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath." So here's a good sort of rule of thumb, I guess. When other people raise your voice, lower yours. Or when other people raise their voices at you, lower yours. That's called strength under control. When you have every reason to raise your voice, but you still don't, that is gentleness, and it's controlling your strength. It's being meek. My mother was the only person historically who could cool my dad off when he blew up and his temper was going crazy. And the way that she would do it was through a calm and gentle voice. So my dad would just get upset and just like rage. And my mom would just stand there and just be like, "Okay, what else? Keep going," until he ran out of steam and had nothing left to try to be angry about. So he would either storm off or he would calm down. And either way, it would help him calm down. In the same way, that kind of gentle answer turned away wrath, if that makes sense. So Ecclesiastes 10:4 also says, "If your boss is angry at you, don't quit. A gentle spirit can overcome even great mistakes." So there's a book that I read in college. It's one of the best books I think I've ever read. It's called Crucial Conversations. This is kind of what it looks like. But it's written by a team of researchers. And what they ended up doing, they did an in-depth study of heated conflicts and difficult conversations, ranging from standing up to a boss, pointing someone else's mistakes out, firing someone, breaking up with somebody, or any kind of confrontational conversation where emotions are high, stakes are high, and there's a lot on the line. What they found was a very, very clear pattern with the most respected workers in multiple organizations. So here's a quote from the book. It said, "At the heart of almost all chronic problems in our organizations, our teams, our relationships, lie crucial conversations, ones that we're either holding or not holding well. 20 years of research involving more than 100,000 people reveals that the key skill of effective leaders, teammates, parents, and loved ones is the capacity to skillfully address emotionally and politically risky issues, period." It was widespread. Over 100,000 people they surveyed, and the most respected people in every company, families, whatever, were the people who could handle those kinds of conversations gently. That's what they found. They found that the way in which these standout individuals navigated these conversations puts into practice the very things we're talking about today. So here's the major practical reason why you should learn about gentleness and continue to learn and ask God for Him to cultivate it in you. Because if you can master gentle communication with people, no matter how difficult the conversation is, you will become that guy wherever you're at. You will be respected. You'll be the person that everybody would point at if those researchers walked into the room and said, "Who is that guy at your organization?" I highly recommend that you get this book. It helps me keep everything under control, and it's helped me in multiple conversations at work, with family, with friends. It's helped me in so many different cases. Even if you don't think you need it. Actually, especially if you don't think you need this book, you should definitely get this book. If you couple it with the Bible, it can guide you. This is what we did in college. We coupled it with the Bible, so it would guide us to interact with people in the way that Jesus would. And this is what I think is really close to how Jesus would have handled these kinds of conversations and how he did handle these kinds of conversations. But yeah, so that's number one. Number one, gentleness diffuses conflict. Number two, gentleness disarms critics. It disappoints them. They're looking for a reaction, something that they can criticize you further for, and they're expecting you to get mad back. The more influence you have, the more critics you have. Likewise, the more Christ-like you are, the more critical people are going to be of you. Especially, don't be surprised if the biggest critics come from within the church itself. That's how it was in Jesus' day, and it's not really too different now. I mean, if you look around, I think about all the sermons I've watched in my lifetime. How many of those sermons were captivating to me at the time because of the force of the words that were being spoken? How many times have I been convinced by a pastor to believe something or think something just because he was harsh and blunt with his delivery? And I'm not saying that being forward and clear and unambiguous with your language is bad, particularly. But when a speaker uses harsh language, it does what the proverb says. It stirs up anger, it gushes folly, and it crushes the spirit. Some people are actually addicted to the feeling of anger. The only way that they can actually feel good and alive and energetic is when they get really worked up about something. That's why it's important to be gentle with our critics, because if we react in the same way or the way that they want us to react, then that gives them the permission to go further and really get angry. And this, in a way, kind of gives them an adrenaline high, which feels really good. So, especially for people with anger management issues mixed with depression, getting angry can often be the only thing that brings them out of that numb state. It's the only time that they feel anything. It's the only time they feel alive during the day. So they cling to it and they prey on every opportunity that they get to vent their pent-up rage, I guess. In essence, when someone is being nasty to us, it may not even be because of us at all, right? It could just be because they love anger and they need it. That's why gentleness is so powerful in our response to our critics. When we respond in gentleness, we give them zero reasons to continue criticizing us. And at the same time, we put to rest their original criticisms. Take, for example, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He led a movement that was stubbornly dedicated to gentleness as its main tool to fight for change in the U.S. He was, and it is, extremely famous, and he had and still has many harsh critics. On January 30th in 1956, about 45 days before my dad was born, Martin Luther King Jr.'s house was bombed while he was away, and his wife and daughter were both home. Somebody just threw a bomb onto his front porch. He came back immediately and was confronted by over 300 supporters who were ready with guns and knives to retaliate. Police tried to disband the crowd, but they grew more restless, and they were demanding that they stay until they could be sure of the King family's safety. Then, Dr. King stepped onto his porch. This is the same day his house got bombed. He stepped out onto his porch, he reached his hands out to the crowds, and he said, "Don't do anything panicky. Don't get your weapons. If you have weapons, take them home. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. We are not advocating violence. We want to love our enemies. After that, the crowd dispersed. A police officer at the scene said that if King hadn't said something that day, he probably would have lost his life, because that's how much the crowds wanted revenge. But gentle word, what was the word? A gentle word turns away wrath. This was the first major moral test of the civil rights movement. The first time Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had to actually put into practice the things that he was talking about. His nonviolent strategy. And as we can see from history, only 3 days after the bombing, the district court handling the case of the Montgomery bus boycott decided that the segregation of black and white passengers was unconstitutional. So, the legislation that established civil rights for African Americans continued to pour out for the next 12 years. So in essence, the most powerful social justice movement in history of this country was sparked from a simple, humble gentleness and a word to not be provoked to violence. 1 Corinthians 14, you don't have to turn. I'm going to be reading a lot of scriptures, but don't feel like you need to turn to every one of them. It says 1 Corinthians 4, verse 12. It says, when we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure it. When we are slandered, we answer kindly or gently. Titus 2, verse 8 says, your conversation should be so sensible that anyone who wants to argue with you will be ashamed, because there won't be anything to criticize in anything that they say. It's the idea of having a tough skin and a tender heart. Like Moses. I think about Moses and Pharaoh. We're going to talk about Moses in a little bit again, but Moses and Pharaoh. Moses had tough skin and a tender heart. He had the heart that broke for his people. He had the heart that saw that the slavery that was going on in Egypt was wrong. And he had the heart to understand that he was somebody who God was calling to do something about it. But he also had tough skin. He was very much in control of his own emotions. He wasn't somebody who would just, he did have an anger problem a little bit, but he wasn't somebody that generally just went out on a rage and got really worked up about different things and was super emotional about everything. He was mostly a calm, cool, humble, gentle guy. So his heart was tough, or his heart was tender and his skin was tough. Pharaoh, on the other hand, he had thin skin and he had a hard heart. He was easily offended. He was easily hurt. He was easily angered. And his heart was hard, so he didn't care about the Jews. He didn't care about anybody. He just cared about what he wanted for his kingdom and whatever. So that's point number 2. Gentleness disarms critics. And if we can have soft heart and and hard skin, tough skin, then we can be very disarming to the critics that come up in our lives in the future. Number 3, gentleness is persuasive. Proverbs 25, verse 15 says, with patience, a ruler may be persuaded. In our day, we might translate ruler to boss, manager, authority, whatever. CEO. With patience, they may be persuaded. And a soft tongue can break bones. Proverbs 16:21 says, the wise of heart is called perceptive, and a pleasant speech increases persuasiveness. Here's a good rhyming phrase for you to write down. I'm never persuasive when I'm abrasive. I'm never convincing when I'm brash towards people, when my words are harsh. If we approach our rulers, or rather bosses or managers or parents or whatever authorities are over us with abrasiveness, we will not get our way with them because they have no requirement to do what we say. None. So if we wish to be convincing to somebody who doesn't ever have a requirement to serve us or do things for us, make your words soft. Exercise patience with them. Being pleasant to them. That's what increases persuasiveness. The more pleasant you are, the more presence you'll get from the people above you. Number 4, gentleness is attractive. 1 Timothy 6:11 says, "Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness." There's a really good story in the Bible about this woman named Ruth. It's fantastic. This is a good story about how gentleness can be attractive. And so for anybody who's single in the area, in this place, listen up. So this will be helpful for you. So Ruth, she was this non-Jewish woman who had lost her husband. And she was wandering the fields one day after the harvest, and she was walking around trying to find extra pieces of wheat. It was a practice that was called gleaning. It was just like after somebody had plowed their fields, you just go out and pick up the scraps of the wheat and everything that you can find. And they would generally leave some extras in Hebrew culture for that specific purpose, for homeless people or people who were in poverty to just get their food and be able to survive. So one day there was this field that was owned by this man, Boaz, and Naomi, her sister, Ruth's sister, and Ruth were both out in the field. They were both gathering all this wheat, and they were talking amongst each other. And Ruth decides to go to Boaz and do some shady things, but in a good, intentive way, in the way that she was trying to get somebody to be a guardian redeemer for her family. She was trying to get somebody to redeem not just the lifestyle that they had, but the shame, the cultural shame that comes with being a widow in that day. So she went to Boaz, laid at his feet, laid with him, and just told him, hey, I need your help. I need you. I need your help. And Boaz was so gentle with her. He saw her in the field already. He knew that she had this situation, but he also knew that she wasn't Jewish. And so it was really not accepted to go around marrying non-Jewish people, especially a widow. So Boaz's gentleness was attractive to Ruth. He brought her in and said, absolutely, I'll do this, and blah, blah. And then they fell in love, and he went to go get married, and there was all of this just a beautiful love story between them. Now, the story of Ruth was important for many, many reasons. From this gentle interaction, from this just 4-chapter section in the Bible, there's this woman who becomes the great-grandmother of King David. And then from that line, we get Jesus. So Ruth, a non-Jewish woman who was a widow, who was homeless, who was just scrounging for scraps, comes across Boaz, who is Jewish, who has been leaving this wheat out for them, and gets brought in, marries the man, has a baby named Obed, and then that baby, Obed, has another baby later, which was Jesse, which was David's father. So, gentleness brought about the family line of the Messiah, if that is enough to show you that gentleness can be attractive. Gentleness for leaders. Gentleness is a mandate for leaders. Did you know that pastors and leaders within the church are not allowed to argue with anyone? 2 Timothy 2:25 about pastors says, "And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. Opponents must be gently instructed in the hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth, and that they will come to their senses and escape from the trap of the devil, who has taken them captive to do his will." Leaders, in order to preach the gospel with their lives and do so effectively, must never be quarrelsome with others. There are a lot of church leaders who make it their life's work to argue with people, with the world, and the rest of the church even about Jesus. I'm not talking about apologists. I'm talking about zealots and Pharisees. I'm talking about people who think that they know the proper interpretation of every scripture, and people who refuse to be taught, the people who cannot be in the same room with you if you disagree with them, people who look for a fight. Leaders in the body of Christ are not to act in this way ever. We are held to a higher standard because there's much at stake with our line of work, and we constantly walk through the tightrope of faith as we attempt to navigate through ministry and do well by the people that we lead. That's why we can't be running around arguing with everybody who has a different opinion than us. Our job is to gather, not scatter the sheep. Like Peter was told in John 21, feed the sheep, feed the lambs, take care of the sheep. This can't be accomplished by fighting every sheep and forcing them to follow you back to Jesus. This can only be done with gentleness and understanding, patiently guiding the sheep back to Jesus. Number 5, gentleness is Jesus-ness, Christ-likeness. The week that I was attending, this week I was attending a young adults group, and we were talking about how Jesus was thought often of as like Jesus is God, or Jesus is like God. But we don't really think about how God is like Jesus, how God the Father chose Jesus as the expression of who he is, his heart, his actions, his mind, his interactions with humanity in the world. During his life, Jesus put on display the heart of the Father, his intentions. He did this while only flipping tables one time, and he raised his voice only when he was in the presence of those who could not speak for themselves. He spoke gently, he worked gently, he treated people with grace and kindness, and it was all done with the immeasurable strength of God behind all of it. He said in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." When we walk around with gentleness and humility in our hearts, we become beacons. The world doesn't operate in this way usually. We're not particularly drawn to humility. As a human race, we value the strongest, most confident person in the room, not the one who bends down to wash his servant's feet. But if we choose to allow God to cultivate gentleness and humility in our hearts, what happens? For one, according to Jesus, in Matthew, we will be given rest. Not just any rest, but a deep soul rest. Our burdens will become light. Additionally, and just as importantly, we will become like Jesus. And in our interactions with others, when we respond, we will always respond with gentleness and humility, which will give rest to those around us. So finally, what is the difference between meekness and weakness? If we're going to be gentle people, we need to be meek, because we all have power, we all have strength, but the idea of gentleness is to relent, is to consciously choose not to react, not to overreact, at least. I'm not sure if this is true, but I heard Rick Warren say in the sermon about 10 years ago, and I blame him if it's not true, but it's potentially a very interesting Bible fact. He said that there are only two people in the Bible who are described as meek, Jesus and Moses. We just talked about Jesus, so let's look at Moses. Neither of them were weak by any means. They were two of the strongest leaders in the Bible. Moses, especially with everything that he did, was amazing leader from the Old Testament, and then we obviously have Jesus, who is God. Amazing leader. So there's two people called meek, though. We just talked about Moses was described as the most humble man in the world, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth, according to Numbers 12:3. Why did they call him meek then? Well, Moses actually had a really bad anger problem. He had a violent temper. And it was his temper that got him into trouble his entire life. When he was younger, he got so angry and infuriated at the injustice that an Egyptian soldier was putting on the Jews that he killed the man with a rock. I think it was a rock. Again, later on, when he had just come down from God's presence on the mountain, and he saw whatever they were doing, worshiping and all this stuff with the golden calf, what did he do with the tablets that God literally inscribed? He just slammed them on the ground. It's like, what are you doing? God's like, all right, buddy, you got to go and make the other 10. I'm not doing that again for you. So the anger led him to have that consequence, to have to go back up on the mountain, and he had to hand chisel every tablet again. And then again, later in his life, when he was older, when God told him, instead of striking this rock like you always and traditionally have done for the past 40 years, we're going to have you speak to the rock gently this time. And Moses was like, no! And he slammed the rock with his stick, and that was what kept him out of the promised land. So he kept facing these moments where he had to learn about gentleness and where he had to face his consequences for not being gentle. So that is where we see meekness. So if we only see a few of those outbursts and things like that, there's hope for people who struggle with anger, in that you can be taught. As long as you are teachable, your anger isn't a problem with God. That's how a guy with a lifelong problem with anger can become the only leader in the Bible who's called gentle, meek, and humble. He was teachable. He didn't get angry at people who brought issues up to him. He listened to them and he considered their point of view. He changed when he saw an issue. He was humbled in God's presence. And God also caused Moses to experience consequences for his anger that taught and disciplined Moses as a leader. When we think of meekness, we can sometimes picture it as weakness. We think, if I hold my anger back, like, how is this person going to learn that their words and actions are wrong? If I don't tell this person off, I make myself vulnerable to being hurt again. So I need to protect myself by retaliating. And we think to ourselves, if I'm hurting and I didn't do anything wrong, and if this person is not hurting after doing me wrong, that's an imbalance of justice. Getting back to them would just be a return to equilibrium. According to this point of view, strength is characterized as vengeful, protective, violent, and unmoving. Whereas weakness is characterized as lazy, apathetic, overly lenient, and gentle. But that's not how meekness works. Meekness biblically is often defined using a metaphor. I assume most of us have seen like a horse racing movie or some kind of horse movie in our lifetimes. And if you haven't, you're not missing too much. But there's a few, like Black Beauty, Seabiscuit, Secretariat. Some of them are inspiring or whatever, but they're about horses. So, like, I'm not really into that. Anyway, in these movies, there's commonly like a wild horse. And this is the metaphor that we use in the Bible. There's commonly a wild horse who has tons of strength and power and heart, and they're struggling with their jockeys. And then there's finally this one who's able to control all of the horse's power and strength and uses it to run really fast in a circle or whatever. The point is that these people were able to harness that horse's power. And the horse was able to control itself to focus its energy to running a race instead of going all over the place. The only difference, those horses are no less powerful when they win the Triple Crown than when they were wild. The only difference is that all the power and strength is controlled by the jockey and focused into running the race instead of all over the place. This is what biblical meekness is like. Again, Jesus and Moses were both called meek and extremely humble, but neither of them were by any means weak. Moses showed that he had power, and in one moment, enough anger to kill a man. Jesus is God, so obviously he has infinitely more power than Moses, but both men restrained themselves, bending down to serve instead of turning their noses up. And when they spoke to power, they spoke in God's power. Jesus to Pilate and Moses to Pharaoh both understood that the powers standing in front of them were incomparable to the glory of God. And Moses simply said, "Gently, let my people go." Jesus said nothing to Pilate until he was spoken to about Pilate's power. He responded gently as well, saying, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." This simple line was enough for Pilate to try unsuccessfully to let Jesus go free from then on. So in both cases, Jesus and Moses were meek. They both had access to unlimited power of God, but neither of them touted it around like a dictator. Instead, both of them were discerning, knowing what they could do, but consciously choosing to relent. Gentleness is meekness. And as we can see, there is great power and great inheritance in meekness. Why do the meek inherit the earth? Because they don't overreact. They have a cool head. They are emotionally stable, so that anything that happens around them cannot shake what is within them. And their gentleness is an expression of God's power. So really fast, 3 applications. Number 1, when somebody serves me, be understanding, not demanding. This is how we can be gentle. Philippians 2b through 5, or 3b through 5. In humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Gentle people help more than themselves. Harsh people help only themselves. Number 2, when someone disagrees with me, be tender without surrender. Romans 14:1, it says, "Accept those whose faith is weak without quarreling over disputable matters." One person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The one who eats everything must not treat with contempt these who do not, and the one who does not eat anything or everything must not judge the one who does, for God has accepted them. In other words, welcome with open arms those who don't see the way you do. Everything, even when we have strong opinions and are weak in faith, people have their own relationships with God and a whole unique life that they're dealing with. We can't know that. I never get my point across by being cross. You don't have to devastate those that you are arguing with, that you're dealing with. Even when they have strong opinions, you don't have to devastate them. At some point, you have to decide, I'm going to make a point. Am I going to make a point, or am I going to make a friend? When somebody disappoints you, this is the last thing. When someone disappoints you, be gentle and not judgmental. Ephesians 4:32 says, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you." God has cut you a lot of slack. A lot of slack. He's given you a lot of grace. He's forgiven you a whole lot more. And He's given you more forgiveness than you will ever have to give in your lifetime. So you better show everybody else a lot of grace too. You better give people a lot of slack and forgive at every turn as well. What angered Jesus the most were self-righteous people who thought that they were supposed to spend all their time being God's appointed judges to the people on earth. But what Jesus said in Matthew 5 was that the meek will inherit the earth. The meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity, says Psalm 37. And Romans 4:13 says, "It was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be the heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith." So our righteousness that comes through our faith, I pray, would make us meek and allow us to understand that, yes, while we do have the power of God and access to it, that power leads us to be humble. That power guides us to understand who we are in the face of God's glory. So in our humility, treat people gently. Treat people with kindness. Speak to people in a gentle way, and you'll start to see little revivals and outbreaks happen in your life.